Most men spend their whole lives holding on to what little they have. A plot of land, a worn saddle, a horse that knows them by name. Out on the frontier, those things were not luxuries. They were the difference between breathing tomorrow and not. So when a man gives away the only horse he owns to a stranger, most people would call him a fool. But there are moments in a man's life when the right thing to do is so clear, so undeniable, that holding on to reason feels like the real betrayal. This is one of those moments. And what came after, what rode out of the hills in the dust of a dying afternoon, would prove that some choices echo far beyond the man who makes them. Gideon Cross had not spoken to another living soul in 11 days. That was not unusual for him. He had carved out a life of deliberate silence in the high desert country of the New Mexico territory, somewhere between the Mescalero Badlands and the foothills that bled into the Sacramento Mountains. His homestead was nothing to look at. A single-room cabin built from split timber and clay, a lean-to stable that groaned in the wind, and a well that ran muddy in the dry months and clear only when the sky bothered to open up. He had a small herd of cattle, 14 head when the season was good, fewer when the mountain lions got bold, and he had one horse. A big, slope-shouldered sorrel named August. 16 hands of stubborn loyalty, the kind of animal that had saved his life twice and expected nothing in return but water, grain, and the occasional softness of a man's hand against his jaw. Gideon had bought August from a Comanche trader 7 years before, paying nearly everything he had at the time. In the years since, the horse had become something more than livestock and less than a person. Something in between, a companion that required no conversation and offered none, which suited Gideon perfectly. He talked to August sometimes in the long evenings when the coyotes started their crying and the dark pressed in close against the lantern light. He told the horse things he had never told a human being, not because he was lonely, because speaking those things aloud, even to an animal that couldn't understand, seemed to dissolve them. On the morning that changed everything, Gideon had ridden August out along the eastern ridge to check on a section of fence line that the late-season winds had been working at for weeks. The sky was pale and enormous, the kind of blue that looked painted, and the air smelled of juniper and the faint mineral bite of the earth after a cold night. He had the fence work done by mid-morning, the wire restrung and the cedar posts tamped back into their holes, and he was heading back south along a dry wash when he saw her. She was running. Not the panicked running of someone who has just started to be afraid, the ragged, desperate running of someone who had been afraid for a very long time and was running on borrowed endurance. She came across the open ground at the base of the ridge, in long, uneven strides. Her right arm held tight against her side, her breathing audible even from 50 yards. She was young, 17 or perhaps 18, Apache by the look of her clothing and the particular bead pattern along the hem of her dress. Her black hair had come loose from whatever it had been bound in and streamed behind her. She had no horse, no pack, nothing in her hands. Just herself and whatever was chasing her. Gideon pulled August to a stop and watched. His hand did not go to the rifle on his saddle. He had learned, in 11 years of living in this territory, that reaching for a weapon was often the fastest way to need one. He waited, looked past her to the ridgeline. Nothing moved up there. Whatever she was running from was not immediately visible, which either meant she had outrun it, or it was not the kind of thing you could see until it was already on top of you. She saw him and stopped. The distance between them was perhaps 30 yards. Her chest was heaving. She stared at him with dark eyes that held no pleading in them, only a sharp and furious assessment, the look of someone calculating the odds of one danger against another. There was blood soaking through the side of her dress, a dark stain spreading below her ribs on the right side. Not a bullet wound. The shape of it was wrong, too broad. Something had cut her, or she had fallen against something sharp, and she had been running on that wound for long enough that it had soaked through the cloth entirely. Gideon did not speak. He dismounted slowly, keeping his hands visible, and he stood beside August and waited. This was something he understood about people who had been badly frightened. Speaking too quickly, too eagerly, was the same as crowding them. You gave them space to make their own decision about you. She looked at him, at his hands, at August, back at his face. Then she said something in Mescalero Apache that Gideon did not fully understand, though he caught the shape of it. A question, low and direct. She was not begging. She was asking. He replied in the few words of her language that he knew, the ones a man picks up from years of trading and boundary making, and the occasional longer conversation with men who bothered to bridge the language between them. He said he meant no harm. He said she was bleeding. She already knew she was bleeding. The look she gave him made that very clear. Gideon opened his saddlebag and took out the cloth he used for camp wounds, an old but clean length of muslin, and he held it out toward her. He did not move closer. He simply held it out and waited again. She crossed the ground between them in 4 steps, took the cloth from his hand without touching his fingers, and pressed it against her side without flinching. Up close she was taller than he had expected, nearly his own height, with a quality of stillness beneath the urgency that reminded him of the old men he had known. People who have been through enough that even crisis does not fully break the surface of them. He gestured toward the wound, a question. She shook her head. Not a refusal, a reassurance. Not deep enough to kill her, the gesture said. But she needed to stop running. She needed to not be standing in the open. He asked where she was going. She looked south. He knew what was south of here. The territory that ran toward the reservation lands, a 2-day walk at a healthy pace, far longer with an injury like this one, and no water, and the sun already beginning its long climb toward the height of the afternoon. He looked at August. August looked back at him with the patient, slightly judgmental expression the horse had perfected over 7 years. What Gideon Cross did next was not something he decided so much as something that arrived fully formed, the way the clearest decisions sometimes do. He uncinched the saddle and lifted it from August's back. He set it against a boulder at the base of the ridge. He checked the saddlebags, kept the rifle and the canteen and a small supply of dried venison, set the rest aside on the saddle. Then he turned to the girl and held out August's reins. She stared at him. He held out the reins. She said something he could not translate, something short and pointed, and he thought it might be a version of the question he would have asked if their positions were reversed. "What do you want for this? What is the price?" He shook his head, held out the reins again. She took them. For a long moment she stood with the reins in her hand, looking at him the way you look at a thing you have not made sense of yet. Then she put her foot in the stirrup and swung up into the saddle with the ease of someone who had grown up on horseback. She looked down at him from August's back, and the expression on her face was complicated, not gratitude exactly, or not only gratitude. Something more like recognition, like she was filing something away. She said one word in her language that he did not know. Then she turned August south and rode. Gideon stood in the dry wash with his saddle at his feet and the canteen in his hand, and watched her go until the dust swallowed her, and the sound of hoofbeats flattened out into the silence of the desert. Then he picked up his saddle, slung it over his shoulder, and began the long walk home. If you are finding this story worth your time, go ahead and hit that like button. It helps more than you know, and it tells us you want more stories like this one. The walk back to the homestead took most of the afternoon. Gideon was not a young man. He was 43, with a bad left knee that made itself known on downhill grades and in cold weather, and the morning's fence work had already put miles on him. He walked without complaint, the way he did most things, without elaborating on the difficulty of them. The sun tracked its arc and the shadows stretched long and copper-colored across the ground by the time he pushed open the door of the cabin and set the saddle down inside. He ate cold beans from the previous night's pot. He drank water from the clay jar he kept on the shelf. He sat outside on the single step that served as his porch and smoked a cigarette and looked at the lean-to stable where August was not. It was a peculiar feeling. Not regret, he was sure enough of that. But the absence had weight to it, the way all absences do when you have grown accustomed to a presence. The stable looked different without the sorrel's head hanging over the half-door, ears forward at the sound of approaching footsteps. The evening felt quieter, more final. He had done the math on the walk home. Without August, getting to town for supplies would require either buying or borrowing a horse, which meant money or obligation, neither of which he had in abundance. Moving cattle would be harder. Checking the fence line would take twice as long. The practical consequences of what he had done stacked up clearly in his mind, and he looked at them the way you look at the price of something after you have already paid it. He did not regret it. He went inside when the stars came out and slept the way he usually slept, quickly, deeply, without ceremony. He did not hear them arrive. The sound that woke him was not a sound exactly, but a change in the quality of the silence, the way the air feels different when the room is no longer empty. He opened his eyes in the darkness of the cabin and lay still, listening, one hand moving slowly toward the rifle he kept against the wall beside the bed. Then a voice came from outside, low, measured, speaking in Apache. Gideon sat up. He did not grab the rifle. He pulled on his boots and his shirt, and he walked to the door and opened it. There were 7 of them. They sat on horseback in the gray pre-dawn light, arranged in a loose half-circle before his cabin, their horses still and quiet. They were not painted for war. They carried rifles and bows, but the weapons were not raised. The man at the center of the group was perhaps 60 years old, broad-shouldered and straight-backed in the saddle, with silver-streaked hair and the kind of face that authority builds over decades. Not harsh exactly, but absolute. He wore a single eagle feather at the back of his head. He looked at Gideon with an expression that revealed nothing and asked for nothing, which was somehow more unsettling than anger would have been. Gideon stood in his doorway and said, in English, that he did not have coffee made, but he could start some if they wanted to wait. Nobody moved. He said, in the words of their language he knew, that he meant no harm and that he would hear whatever they had come to say. The man at the center spoke. His voice was unhurried, each word placed with deliberate precision, and though Gideon could not follow every construction of the language, the shape of the message came through clearly enough. He was being asked a question. One question, direct and without ornamentation. Why did you give her the horse? Gideon thought about this for a moment. Not because he did not know the answer, but because he wanted to give the answer he actually had, not a version of it dressed up to sound better. He said, and he said it in a mixture of English and the Apache words he knew, filling the gaps with gesture and the kind of patient repetition that sometimes crosses language when both parties are trying honestly. That she was bleeding, that she was alone, that the horse was the only thing he had that could help her, and he had it, so he gave it. Silence. The man at the center looked at him for a long time. The other riders were still. Somewhere behind the hills, the sky was beginning to turn from black to deep violet, the first threadbare suggestion of morning. Then the older man spoke again, and this time his words were slower, spaced further apart, and Gideon understood more of them. He understood enough to know that what he was being told was not a threat. It was a story, a short one. The girl's name, the older man said, and this Gideon understood clearly, was Saya. She was his youngest daughter. 3 days before, she had gone with a small group to trade at a settlement to the east, and on the way back they had been attacked by a group of men Gideon understood to be whiskey runners, men who moved illegal spirits through the territory and who had reasons of their own to discourage Apache travel in certain corridors. Saya had been separated from the group in the chaos. She had been running for 2 days. Her father had ridden through the night to find her. A rider at the back of the group clicked his horse forward, and Gideon saw that it was not a warrior at all, but a young woman. And she was riding August, and she was looking at Gideon with that same complicated expression she had worn when she took the reins from him in the dry wash. August looked at Gideon with the slightly injured dignity of a horse who has had a longer day than expected. Saya said something to her father. He listened without expression. She said something more. He was quiet for a moment. Then he looked back at Gideon and spoke again. And one of the younger warriors, a man perhaps 20 years old with quick, careful eyes, translated haltingly into English, catching words that Gideon missed and filling in the places where the language ran out. The father said, "A man who gives away his only horse to help a stranger who cannot help him in return is either a fool or a man of rare character." And after 2 days of searching for his daughter, he was not in the mood to credit fools. He said the horse would be returned. It was not Saya's to keep. He said, what did Gideon Cross need? It was not a polite question. It was a practical one, the kind that closes accounts. Gideon had given something. What did he need in return? This was not charity. It was the acknowledgement of a debt, stated plainly between men who understood that debts existed and ought to be settled. Gideon said he needed nothing. The young translator relayed this. Saya's father looked unmoved. Gideon said, and he said it carefully because he meant it and did not want it to sound like a performance, that the horse had been given freely, that he had not given it in order to receive something. If he had expected return, he would have said so at the time. He had not. So there was no debt. Another silence. Longer this time. Saya's father dismounted. He moved without hurry, with the economy of motion that long years of physical life produce in a person, and he walked to within a few feet of Gideon and stood there and looked at him at close range, the way you examine something you are deciding about. Whatever he decided, Gideon never fully knew. But the man put out his hand, not in the Anglo handshake style, but palm forward, a gesture of acknowledgement, and Gideon met it with his own, and something passed between them that neither of them put into words, because words would have made it smaller. Subscribe to this channel right now so you don't miss a single one of these stories. Every week we come back to this place where the land was hard and the choices were harder, and we find the moments that remind us what it means to be human. They stayed until full morning came. Saya's father sat on the step of Gideon's cabin, and the young translator sat beside him, and they talked, haltingly, imprecisely, with long pauses and occasional laughter when a translation came out absurd, about the land and the water and the changing shape of the territory. Gideon made the coffee he had offered at the beginning and brought it out, and nobody made a thing of it. The other riders dismounted and let their horses drink from the trough. Saya sat apart on a flat boulder at the edge of the yard, her wound rebound in fresh cloth that one of the older women in the group had dressed without ceremony. She was watching the hills to the east, but every so often she looked at Gideon with that measuring attention, as though she was still not entirely finished figuring him out. At one point the translator came and sat beside Gideon and said, not translating from anything the father had said, but speaking for himself, that his people had a word for what Gideon had done. He tried to find the English for it and could not quite get there. The closest he arrived at was something like this: an act that gives without calculation. A gift that is given when giving costs the most. He said that such acts were not common. He said that in his experience, when white men gave things to Apache people, there was almost always something underneath it. A negotiation dressed as generosity. He said he was not accusing. He was explaining why Gideon's particular act was difficult to understand at first. Gideon said he understood that. He said he probably would have thought the same thing in the other man's position. The translator smiled. He was missing one of his front teeth, and the smile was lopsided and genuine. He said, "Yes, probably." Before they rode out, Saya's father returned August to Gideon. He did this without speech, simply brought the sorrel forward and held out the reins. Gideon took them. August pressed his nose against Gideon's chest in a gesture that was either affection or equine grumpiness about the previous day's adventures, and it was impossible to tell which. Then the father reached into the pack, tied behind his saddle, and removed something wrapped in cured hide. He held it out. Gideon took it and unwrapped it and found a bridle, old and exquisitely made, the leather worked with a fine geometric pattern in faded red and blue, the bit and rings of hammered iron that had lasted longer than most of the men who had touched it. It was a thing of real craft, the kind that took time and skill and care in equal measure. Gideon started to speak. The father held up one hand. The young translator said simply, "He says it is not payment. He says it is the beginning of knowing one another." They rode out into the full morning, 8 riders heading north along the ridgeline, their horses easy and unhurried, and Gideon stood in his yard with August's reins in one hand and the old bridle in the other, and watched them until the hills folded them in. He stood there for a while after they had gone, in the quiet of the morning, listening to the land. There are things the frontier teaches you that no book contains and no one can tell you in advance. It teaches you that the categories you arrived with, friend and enemy, safe and dangerous, ours and theirs, are the first things the land strips away, because they are too small for the country. The country is bigger than categories. It demands something more specific, something more honest. The ability to see what is actually in front of you, not what you were told to expect. Gideon Cross had seen a girl who was bleeding and alone and running out of endurance, and he had given her the only useful thing he had. He had not thought about what she was. He had thought about what she needed. Those are different questions, and most people only ever ask the first one. The bridle hung on the wall of his cabin for the rest of his years there. Visitors who came, and there were not many, sometimes asked about it. He told them he had received it from a man he had briefly known and hoped to know better. When they asked how he had come to know this man, he said through a mutual acquaintance. When they asked who, he would look at August, standing in the lean-to stable, and say just an old horse who happened to be in the right place. He never explained further. Some things, he had found, held their weight better when you didn't pile explanations on top of them. In the months that followed, Gideon began to see occasional signs that he was not entirely forgotten by the people who had ridden out of his yard that morning. A deer carcass, field-dressed and hung from the juniper at the edge of his property, left without announcement. A section of fence on the north pasture that had come down in a storm and been set back upright by hands other than his own. Once, after 3 days of watching a mountain lion work the edges of his herd, he found the lion's tracks ending abruptly in the red dirt and a single arrow left standing upright in the earth beside them, which he understood to mean the problem had been resolved and the resolution was a courtesy, offered without obligation or ceremony. He never saw Saya again, not directly. But once, in the late autumn of the year that followed, riding the eastern ridge at dusk, he saw a single rider far up on the high ground, sitting still and watching him. The rider was tall in the saddle, and the horse beneath her was a particular shade of deep brown with a white blaze, not August, but a fine animal. She raised one hand. He raised his. Then she turned and rode into the darkening hills, and the night came on, and the stars opened up above the desert one by one, and Gideon rode home through the cold and the quiet, feeling the particular, wordless satisfaction of a man who has managed, in some small way, to do more good than harm in a place where harm was always easier. The West was not short on men who knew how to take. It was not short on men who knew how to fight, to claim, to hold what was theirs against whatever came for it. But the men who lasted, the ones the land eventually accepted rather than merely tolerated, were the ones who understood that sometimes the bravest, most difficult, most consequential thing you can do is open your hand and let go of the one thing standing between you and ruin, because someone else needs it more. Gideon Cross gave away his only horse to a girl he did not know, in a language he barely spoke, with nothing promised in return. What he got back was not nothing. It was not August, though August came back too. What he got back was harder to name, the sense of living in right relationship with the country and its people, of being for once on the correct side of a long and complicated ledger. That is not a small thing. Out here, in this dust and this heat and this endless sky, it might be the only thing that matters. If this story stayed with you, if it made you think about what you hold on to and what you let go of, leave a comment below and tell me what you would have done in Gideon's place. Would you have handed over the reins? Would you have hesitated? There is no wrong answer, and I want to know what you think. And if you have not subscribed to the channel yet, now is the time. Every story we bring you lives in that same territory where the choices are real and the land remembers everything. Hit that subscribe button, share this with someone who loves a good story, and we will see you on the trail.